What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into some cards I'm looking forward to getting from Ixalan, the new set being released for Magic the Gathering. Overall, this is something that is new to me. I did not get to play when Ixalan was a current set in MTG, as I was part of my break when I was away from Magic a couple years back when it first got released. So it's definitely kind of cool seeing the Ixalan set come back, seeing some new characters and some returning characters from the world of Magic get brought into this set, and kind of messing around with some of the new mechanics and as well as some returning ones. Most of these cards are just cards, there's no particular whether this card's going to be valuable or not. These are just cards that I found interesting and kind of want to mess around with, especially for Commander. But overall, let's just dive into the cards and let's just start talking about them. So here we have Terans Journal. It's a 2-mana legendary artifact that has the ability of sacrificing another artifact or creature. You get to draw a card, and you can only do this as a sorcery. Overall, 2-mana kind of artifact that stands on the battlefield, I think, is going to be pretty decent in general. It is a card that can be played in, standard format, any format in general. It's something I'm probably going to use in my Commander decks just because I do think this is a very solid artifact to have very early. Sure, it's not a mana rock, but being able to draw a card by sacrificing an artifact or a creature could be very good if you have a deck built around creating tokens, maybe that you could use as fodder for this kind of mechanic. Sorcery speed is kind of a bit of a downfall, but, still being able to draw a card just by tapping is always very good. The other thing here is that we can discard our hand and we can transform the journal into the backside, which it turns into a land. That's another thing that's interesting about this set. This returns those cards that have a front side, and then once you kind of do a thing, you then get to flip it over onto its backside. The backside, we get ourselves a legendary land. It's a cave. That's another mechanic that kind of comes along with this set, but is a legendary land that creates black mana. We can also tap it to cast creature spells from our graveyard this turn. If we do, it enters battlefield with a finality counter, and it's a vampire in addition to its other types. So basically what this is saying that this card's going to come into the battlefield, and it's going to pretty much be on the battlefield until it leaves play. When it leaves play, essentially then gets exiled. Having this effect is always very good. It's kind of like a built-in reanimate kind of effect, which is definitely pretty solid. It's definitely going to make a lot of decks that maybe focus around black where they want to reanimate stuff from the graveyard by discarding cards in general, even discarding their hand to kind of flip it to this side. Make it very powerful. Overall, it's a very solid card. It's only rare, which makes it very approachable, trying to get copies maybe at a decent price. And overall, I do think this card is going to be pretty decent in those kind of decks that want to reanimate stuff. This could also be splashed into decks that have other colors, so I do think that's also very viable. There are decks like that may play Jund, may play 5 colors, play a wider range of things, and having this ability is just going to make those decks a little bit more powerful. And I do think being able to discard your hand to do this is it's not always the best thing, but if you discard, some decent things, or there's decent things in your graveyard, it may not be the worst thing either, because then at least you can play things from the graveyard to kind of get that extra value. But overall, a card I'm very excited to kind of pick up and test out and see how it performs. Moving on, we have ourselves a blue card here. It's Tanasha's Tidebender. It's a 3-mana 3/2 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, counter up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. If it's an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker, counter this way. That permanent loses all abilities for as long as this is on the battlefield. So this is kind of like a unique card. It's kind of like a card like Stifle, if you know what that is. It's like a counter target activated ability, but it's also a creature that's kind of like an enchantment that or aura that's targeting that card that makes it lose all abilities. So if you target maybe their planeswalker, maybe target their commander, maybe just target maybe their most powerful card on the battlefield, that's definitely going to be pretty powerful. And just making that card not be able to do any of its effects until this leaves the battlefield, I think is definitely very powerful. And at 3 mana, I do think this is definitely not a bad card to have. You still get a body out of it, and worst case scenario, it dies after a turn or two, but yet again, you negated maybe that effect that maybe they were going to pop off with. The next card up on this list is going to be Kalamax Stormsire. It's a 4-mana 4/4 that whenever we cast our first instant spell each turn, if this is tapped, we get a copy of that spell. So this is definitely very good in general. Typically, you're probably going to attack with it on your turn when you can, and then you're going to be able to maybe copy spells on your opponent's turns or even your own turn. And then whenever we copy an instant spell, we get the +1/+1 counter on it. So this is definitely going to be something that could be very powerful. Definitely get something that gets out of hand very quickly if your opponent doesn't have any sort of way to deal with it. I would say you're probably not casting this immediately out on turn 4, just because you probably want to leave that mana open to protect it, because 1, you'll get the +1/+1 counter, 2, you'll be able to probably negate whatever they're trying to do to answer this card. And this is definitely going to be one of those cards that I could see people playing as a commander, because Teamer is definitely very good at doing stuff like this, and this is definitely a good card to have as maybe a Teamer commander that wants to focus around spells, maybe try to do things with prowess. I'm not really sure, but definitely some ideas that kind of come to mind when I think of this card in those style of decks. decks. The next card up on this list is going to be Miri, Weatherlight Duelist. It's a 3-mana 3/2 first striker that whenever it attacks, each opponent can't block with more than one creature this combat. And then as long as it is tapped, no more than one creature can attack you each combat. This card's also very good as it makes combat very difficult for your opponents in general, just because it puts that kind of like block on combat that they can't block, more than maybe your biggest thing. They have to kind of get rid of this to kind of make them have additional blockers. And then in return, if you decide to swing out in a way, you're not going to be threatened maybe by a bunch of creatures coming back at you because of her secondary effect. This definitely makes that very strong as well. This is a card that you could see maybe in some style of token decks that wants to try to, be aggressive and attack very wide, allowing it to kind of, negate the possible comeback attack at you. This card's definitely going to be very playable. I think it's a 3-mana, 3/2 with first strike. Definitely very castable as a commander or even in a deck. It is legendary. You only can have one. The next card up is Osier Tak, the Deepest Fountain. It's a 6-mana, 6/6 with Vigilance. It's a god. It's one of the new cards from the set. It also has a flip side that becomes a land. But if one or more creature tokens would be created under our control, 3 times that many tokens are created instead. And whenever it dies, it's transformed under its owner's control as the flip side. So it has some sort of protection to kind of get it back. But I do think having some additional ways to populate additional tokens is definitely very good. This is definitely one I would want because I do play a token style mirror deck, and this is definitely a card that would work at allowing me to add additional copies of mirrors onto the battlefield that I would generate. But nonetheless, being able to do it 3 times that many, so if you were to get 1, you would then get 3 instead, and then you have any additional ways to generate additional tokens. On top of this, you're going to generate a ton of tokens, and it's going to be very overwhelming. You're going to have a bunch of tokens out on the battlefield being very wide, and your opponent's going to be like, holy crap, how do I deal with this? I mean, even thinking in like the standard environment, this plus like weapon announcement is definitely very good. Instead of generating 1 token at the end of each of your turns, you're going to generate 3. And then at some point, it's going to flip to the third thing. And then all those tokens will get +1/+1. And then it kind of goes on and on from there. And then the other thing too with the card, like I said, if it does die, probably your opponent's going to be like, I need to get rid of this. If they don't exile, it'll come back onto its flip side, which is just a regular land that adds white mana. And then we can tap 3, transform this card back to its front side, activate only if we attack with 3 or more creatures this turn, and only as a sorcery. So, it's a card that's definitely very playable. If you're playing a token deck, you definitely can get very wide. And this is a card that kind of lines up very well with that style of deck, just because if this dies and they don't wipe out the rest of the board, you're definitely going to have a way to generate that possible attack to kind of flip it immediately back one way or the other. But overall, very, very powerful card that I'm looking forward to trying out and testing in some various token style decks. The next card up on this list is going to be the Roman Throne. It is a 4-mana, 4/4 Ward 2. As it enters the battlefield, we have to choose a creature type. Roman Throne is the chosen type in addition to its other types. So if it's a Golem Goblin, it'll become a Golem Goblin. And then the great part about this card, and I think why this card is definitely going to see a lot of play, especially in Commander, is that if a trigger ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. So any sort of way, like ETB effects, any effects of attack triggers, anything that's going to trigger something, you'll get 2 triggers, so you get that extra value. And this is going to be a great card to play in those creature type focused decks. It's a card that I'm considering to put in my mirror deck because my mirror deck is mostly artifacts and it's essentially all mirrors, and being able to get additional triggers of my mirrors effects is definitely going to be very good there. But overall, very solid card for 4 mana and definitely a good kind of body just to have in general. The next card up is going to be the Mazzalanti, the Great Door. It's a 3-mana legendary artifact that we get to tap and draw a card and discard a card. This is at instant speed, so definitely good there. And then we can tap 4, we can transform the Great Door, activate only if there are 4 more permanent types among cards in our graveyard. So this is one of those ones that's going to want 4 different card types in our graveyard, which isn't too bad if you kind of your spread that be like instants, sorceries, land, creature, planeswalker, enchantment. Depending on how you build your deck, this is going to be one of those things you want to consider, especially playing this card. It is legendary, so you can only have one of them out at a given time, but it does flip over into a pretty solid card, which is the Core. This is a legendary land that has the ability to tap, add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of permanent cards in our graveyard. So this is going to be one of those cards that, we have been adding card types in our graveyard, and we have then go ahead and we can be like, okay, now that we flipped it over, we can add at least, if we have a planeswalker, we have an enchantment, we have a creature or 2, we're going to add X amount of mana based on the total of those cards that are now in our graveyard. outside the instant sorceries because those aren't permanents, but any other permanent cards in our graveyard, this land is going to produce mana of that one color. This is going to be a solid card, I think, that's going to see a ton of play in maybe monocolor decks because adding one particular color and adding a bunch of it is going to be very good. It's going to make your opponents have to play some sort of graveyard hate, or this land is going to get out of control because essentially this land will just be able to tap for a bunch of mana. And if your opponent has no way of interacting with it, you're just going to be able to generate a ton of mana without really having to commit too much to it. And the next card up is going to be Amelia Benaverdes Aguirre. It is a 2 mana, white and a black, legendary vampire creature scout. It has ward, pay 3 life, so it's going to be one of those cards that you are going to have to put some life into if you want to remove it directly. Whenever we gain life, Amelia will then explore, and then we destroy all other creatures if its power is exactly 20. So this is kind of another interesting one. This is going to be one that probably doesn't happen so much, but I do think the one thing that's very interesting about this is that it has that like ability to explore. It's a very cheap card that you could definitely play as a commander. It's definitely a good card because there's a lot of cards that are themed around vampires. It may be very easy to gain a ton of life with the vampires that get added in like a standard format, but it's definitely a good card that's going to work very well with vampire style decks in like commander, for example. I know that's kind of like my main example to go to because I do play a decent amount of commander. But I think this other effect is definitely going to be very possible. Is it going to happen very often? Probably not, but being able to play this maybe as your commander for only 2 mana is definitely be very good there. And then the other thing too that's good about this is even if you explore, to have this creature explore, reveal top card of your library, put that card into your hand if it's a land, otherwise put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. And just having that ability to just explore in general, regardless of this ever getting to 20, is going to be very good there. There are ways to generate additional token, like +1/+1 counters on this that you could possibly play to kind of try to speed up that process. But I do think this is going to be one of those cards that is going to work very well in a deck that is going to be kind of trying to focus on a little bit of life gain, as well as playing like maybe some vampires as a creature type. And just having it as a 2 mana 2/2 is definitely very playable and definitely very approachable if that is something that you're looking to do. Now, rounding out this list, I am going to kind of go into some more specific commander only cards, as these are cards I think that are only coming into paper. You're not going to probably see them on Arena, but these are cards that I definitely want to pick up because I do think they're going to be very useful down the road. And I'm not sure if all of these or if any of these are reprints, for example. I'm not sure, like especially with this one, but I do think this card is definitely very good overall in general. And that card is Blood Money. This is a 7 mana destroy all creatures, and then for each non-token creature destroyed this way, you get to create a tap treasure token. This is kind of like one of those cards that you're probably going to try to play when there is that sort of value on the battlefield. If I'm going to pay 7 mana, am I going to probably at least get 7 treasure tokens in return? This is going to be one of those cards that's going to be definitely going to help you, with your next turn, because you're going to have these X amount of treasure tokens on top of whatever untapped mana you have. This is going to be very good there. I know Mono Black has a lot of good ways of generating a ton of mana. You have like Cabal Coffers and whatnot, so that's definitely going to help that in general. But I do think this is going to be an overall interesting kind of like other kind of destroy battlefield effects that's definitely going to see some play, especially in Commander, because I do think this effect is very powerful. And Mono Black has, like I said, has no problem probably getting to 7 mana to really cast this, and just being able to get the additional treasure tokens are going to be very good there as well. And then rounding this out, this is a card that I kind of missed out on because I kind of started getting back into pre-release Magic, but I really wasn't focused on Commander at the time. But this card is going to be Wedding Ring. This is a 4-mana artifact that when it enters the battlefield, we get to choose an opponent, and that opponent gets a copy of this card. And then whenever opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring draws a card during their turn, you get to also draw a card. And whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring gains life, this turn you gain that much life. So it's kind of one of those ones that you give a ring to somebody, you also get the effects, but they also get the effects. So it's kind of like a two-way street. So it's like you kind of maybe want to play some politics with this. Another way that I was kind of messing around with and thinking that how I wanted to use this, I'm not 100% sure if the ruling works. And I tried to look it up, but there was really no rulings on it. But if you had this card and other ways to generate additional tokens or copies of cards, I'm not sure if your opponent has to have that or whatnot. But I was wondering, like the one thing that I'm kind of curious and probably going to try to see if I can follow up with some other people who play Magic, at my local game store and see what they think overall how the triggers work. But if I was able to generate additional copies of this and give them to all opponents, and then we're all drawing additional cards, we're all gaining life whenever other people gain life, it'd definitely be a very weird but also kind of funny thing at the table in general, and definitely something I want to explore with. But yet again, this is a card that I feel like even on its own it's definitely good to have overall in, your my arsenal of cards I would want to play in Commander. And yet again, I don't think this card is very overpowered. I think it's a very fun card. It creates some interesting table dynamics when it comes to playing those politic games, and it's definitely not bad overall. But yeah, these are just some cards I'm interested from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. It's a set I'm definitely excited to start diving into this weekend and playing in some pre-releases. It's definitely a set I'll probably explore a lot on MTG Arena when it drops there. But overall, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know I post videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.